Tim Britton of The Athletic joining me now to discuss the Mets who went on a spending spree this winter and fans hoping that it's going to pay off. Hey, how are you, Tim? Thanks for joining me.
Oh, anytime. Thanks for having me.
I have this weird feeling that the Mets are going to do well this year and maybe win a World Series title. Is that music to a Mets fan's ears or cause for concern with how cautiously pessimistic this fan base has been?
As it is with Mets fans, usually it's a little bit of both. It's been 37 years since they won a World Series back in 1986. They're coming off of a season in which they won 101 games. And yet it still felt like a disappointment by the end of the year because they ended up losing out in the National League East to Atlanta, who caught them down the stretch. They get knocked out in the first round, the wild card round of the playoffs, by the Padres at Citi Field. So it was such a wonderful season for 5.5 months for the Mets, and then it kind of ended with a thud. And then this past winter, they were as active as anyone in baseball, aside from maybe the team that knocked them out last year in San Diego, and bringing in Justin Verlander to replace Jacob deGrom, bringing back Edwin Diaz and Brandon Nimmo. And the hopes are that this team can be every bit as good as the one last year and maybe finish a little bit stronger than that one did.
Has the stung of last season's finish worn off yet?
I think so. I feel like in spring training so far this year, there has been just kind of a business-like confidence with how the Mets have gone about their business. They understand that they were a very good team last year, and they also understand that they were not good enough last year. If they were maybe playing in a different division, that they would feel pretty confident about winning the division with the talent they have in the clubhouse. But they're playing in a National League East where Atlanta won 101 games last year and has won the division 5 years in a row. The Mets won 101 games last year, and it was the Phillies who went to the World Series and won the National League pennant. So you've got three really good teams in this division. The Mets always seem to have trouble with the Marlins as well, who have a great pitching staff. So I think there is a thought that whatever they did last year wasn't good enough, and that drives them this year to be that much better.
It's not like they're the only team in baseball that has spent this offseason. You noted that although, what they owe in just the luxury tax alone is more than the roster of some teams' entirety when you look at their salaries, particularly on the West Coast. What is it about the Mets and Steve Cohen and maybe the way that he kind of does things that draws the ire of some in baseball who say we need a salary cap when there are other teams who take advantage of that also?
Well, I think it's the overall level of spending, which is, we haven't seen a team have a payroll north of $350 million the way that the Mets are carrying into this season. I think their luxury tax payroll is up about $375 million, maybe just a little bit less than that, which means luxury tax penalties themselves are about $100 million. We haven't seen a gross payroll like that in a long time. If you do compare it to kind of the league average payroll, the league median payroll, it's not that much different than what the Dodgers were doing maybe 7-8 years ago at the start of their new ownership with Guggenheim Partners, which is a model that the Mets have said they want to kind of copy, which is you come in, your farm system isn't where you want it to be just yet to supplement your roster with younger players. So you spend in free agency over the first couple of years to supplement your roster, and then you build out your farm system in hopes that it's bringing up players like the Dodgers have brought up over the last several years to make your roster better and less expensive. That's the plan. You have to build the farm system well for that plan to work, and that's not as easy as it is to say it. I think we'll see how willing Steve Cohen is to spend this amount of money. They've got the two highest paid players in baseball, in Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander. They're both on short-term deals. It will be interesting to see when those guys move on, what happens to replace them. Do they have the farm system ready to replace them at that point, or do they have to go out and spend that kind of money again on someone else?
What's the key to making sure that your farm system pays off? Is that a little bit of luck? Is that having superior eyes for talent that sees things that other people don't see?
I think it's investment in your personnel, and that's not necessarily the players you draft and the players you sign in international free agency. It's paying your minor league coaches, your minor league staff, your minor league development people, and we've seen the Mets expand out that area of their team over the last couple of years since Cohen bought them. They restructured their farm system, their minor league development system over the last 2 years, and they've added a lot more people. There's just a lot more inventory there than there was previously, and so they're hoping that helps them. The story isn't just turning your first round draft pick into an all-star player. It's taking someone like Jacob deGrom, who was a 9th round pick, and turning him into a Cy Young winner. When you're able to do that further down in the draft, when you're able to take someone who maybe didn't work for another team's farm system and turn them into someone useful for you, that's when your farm system's really humming.
Just a last point, Tim, on the spending. I mean, there's been so much talk about a salary cap coming. Is that something that you foresee for the sport?
The Players Association is so against a salary cap. It is a non-starter to them. And we've seen, the 1994 strike was about the salary cap. My colleague at The Athletic, Evan Drellick, has written that if baseball wants to put in a salary cap, you're going to lose at least a season to do that in 2027. So I think, the likelier outcome is probably in the next collective bargaining agreement, you have stricter penalties on spending over the luxury tax. The penalties are more or less basically financial for the Mets and Steve Cohen. They put in that extra threshold above the luxury tax, that's the so-called Cohen tax that he has not cared about at all, because it's really just an additional financial penalty. When you start hurting development, when you start pushing draft picks back, when you start penalizing how much you can spend in international free agency, those types of things, maybe that's the way to penalize someone like Steve Cohen versus just trying to take more of his money.
So there isn't a number past that $109 million of luxury tax that you think would be the threshold for Steve Cohen to say, oh man, wait a minute, I got to do something else. I mean, he's so exponentially wealthy that you would have to start hurting the Mets in other ways.
I mean, there's a number. Everyone has a number, right? His number is just a lot higher than most anyone else's. I think it's interesting. You look at this is by far the highest luxury tax payment that a Major League Baseball team has had. If you look in the NBA, teams regularly pay luxury tax. More teams pay the luxury tax in the NBA than in Major League Baseball, even though the penalties are far harsher in the NBA than they are in MLB. So we've seen teams like the Warriors have run luxury tax payments up around where Steve Cohen's Mets are this year, and it's just not the same kind of issue in the NBA because more teams do it.
When you look at this year's lineup, Tim, where do you see the strengths and where do you see the weaknesses, from the pitching staff all the way to the batting order?
I think you start, the strength is number one and number two in the rotation in Scherzer and Verlander. There's not a lot of teams out there that know their number one and number two starters are both going to the Hall of Fame. There's probably four pitchers in baseball you can say that about, and two of them are on this roster. So even with Scherzer's 38, Verlander is 40. Even at those ages, Verlander won the Cy Young last year. Scherzer was one of the best pitchers in the National League. They're both really good still. I think that's a strength. And then you look kind of the depth of the roster is what's changed for the Mets over time. It used to be under the Wilpon ownership that the Mets had a pretty good roster that you could say if everything broke right, they can win 90 games. And now they've got a roster where, even if some things don't break right, they have backup plans. You see that this week, one of their starters, Jose Quintana, goes down with a stress fracture in his rib, but they've got David Peterson, a guy who threw 100 innings at better than the league average ERA last year, as their sixth starter. He can step into the rotation. That's a guy that used to be their number three starter going into the season under the Wilpons. So I think they've got more backup plans than they've had in the past, and the depth of the roster, 1 through 9 in the lineup and even extended to the bench, 1 through 5 in the rotation and extending into the minor leagues, is just a lot different than it used to be.
Do you get the sense that they have a plan for, I guess, game management, how you would call it? Because you do mention the ages of Scherzer and Verlander, Hall of Famers, no doubt about it. But we saw what happened at the end of last season where the momentum was gone at the wrong time. I mean, do you get the sense that they know what they're going to do with those guys to ensure their health heading into October?
Yeah, one of the things that I've written about this spring is their plan to kind of deploy a six-man rotation, not all season, but in specific spots of the season where they have kind of a greater bulk of games, when they play more than 10 games in a row and they've got a stretch, I think, of 22 out of 22 games in 23 days, using a six-man rotation, whether it's Peterson is the guy who was slated to be that sixth starter. They've also got Tyler McGill and Joey Lucchesi as guys who have major league experience and successful major league experience that can step into the rotation, just to give Scherzer, Verlander, and also Kodai Senga, who they signed in the offseason from Japan, who's used to pitching once a week rather than in a five-day rotation, to give those guys an extra day with the hopes that, if you make 29 or 30 starts rather than 32 or 33, those last couple in September and into October are as strong as they can be.
What's the feedback been on Kodai Senga so far in spring training? And do you think that he will play more of a valuable role than maybe some thought heading into this year?
Well, I think it's kind of a risk reward proposition in making the signing for him. The Mets in the offseason, they had three spots in their rotation to replace. They obviously brought in Verlander to replace DeGrom. They brought in Quintana as a guy who's kind of a more reliable innings eater, even with the injury that he currently has. And Senga was kind of the risk reward play where you weren't exactly sure how good he could be. But the early reports from players who have faced him have said that his stuff feels different and looks different than what they're used to. His trademark pitch is a splitter called in Japan it was called the ghost fork because of the way it disappears right at the strike zone. So the Mets are confident that Senga can give them a quality number 3 starter in the rotation, but they also know that transition from Japan, it's not just about the transition to a new league. It's a transition to a new schedule, a new culture, and as Buck Showalter has mentioned this spring, new weather. He's not used to training in spring training in 90-degree Florida heat. It's a little more temperate in Japan this time of year. So there's a lot that goes into it for him. Yeah,
no doubt. And I'm waiting for the Ghost Fork merchandise. I don't know if it's been made already, but it's such a fun sort of storyline with him heading in. You mentioned Showalter. He seems like a player's manager, the right fit for the Mets, despite the fact that they fell short of their ultimate goal last season. Does he very much have, the ear of the clubhouse? In your opinion, is he the right manager for this season and beyond for the organization?
Yeah, I think after what the Mets had gone through in the previous couple of years, they had a pair of first-time managers in Mickey Callaway and Luis Rojas, who didn't work out quite the same way. That Showalter came in with kind of an instant credibility from his long tenure with the Yankees, with the Rangers, and with the Orioles, and with winning Manager of the Year at each of those stops previously, and then he added to it last year with the Mets. He knows what he's doing, and that's always been kind of the reputation that Buck Showalter has had across the sport, and he was able to connect with the Mets players pretty early on in spring training last year, which was noteworthy given that he wasn't able to talk to them all offseason because of the lockout last year. So he didn't have as much run up as he would have liked to, but he knew what the New York market was like, and one of the things he made an emphasis last year was this is a market that wants to embrace you, so embrace that. They want to cheer for you. The Mets in 2021 had much more of an antagonistic relationship with their fan base. Remember, thumbs down at the fan base late in the season. So last year was just a much better relationship between the manager and his team and the team and the fan base, and Showalter was really the one who fostered that.
Yeah, and how crucial is that in this market? I mean, the fans are what they are. They have very high expectations. The pressure is immense, not just on the Yankees across town, but also on the Mets. I mean, is it important to lean into expectation?
Yeah, this is not like playing somewhere else. It's really kind of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia that probably stand out in a very specific way from the rest of the league. And for players coming in for the first time, a guy like Francisco Lindor who had played in Cleveland, it's different in New York. The one thing is last year they didn't have a ton of adversity until the end of the season. They were in first place for almost the entire year, and so the question is, how does this team handle that if it happens in June, if it happens in July? What does that first 5 or 6 game losing streak look like, and how do they handle that kind of adversity that they didn't go through until really the very end of last season?
And I wonder if the timing would be better, midsummer than obviously October when it really starts to matter. And all of a sudden you have a couple of bad games and it's game over for you guys. Just a couple more for you, and then I'll let you go, Tim. The rule changes this year have a lot of people talking. Speeding up the game a little bit has been kind of like that macro goal to maybe draw in more fans. I know some of the purists, the traditionalists, don't find that particularly appetizing because they love the nuance of the game. But all the other rule changes as well, some of them will affect certain teams more than others. I mean, how do you think the Mets will fare with some of these changes going into the year?
I do think they are more of a contact-oriented offense, and that's probably a good thing to have at this point in time when teams can't shift you quite the same way. They don't have too many guys who are the extreme, left-handed pull hitters where they get shifted 90% of the time. Eduardo Escobar and Omar Narvaez are the two guys who were shifted the most for them last year. And so those guys might find an extra base hit here or there. But I think just being able to put the ball in play, there should be more grass for the ball to find over the course of the season without the shift in place. And then we've seen Max Scherzer in the course of spring training, really experimenting with how he can push the pitch clock to his advantage as a pitcher, to be, that the hitters are just as unaccustomed to it as pitchers, that he gets himself used to it. If he's ready at, the first time a hitter looks up and can deliver a pitch, that could be to his advantage. We've seen him tinkering around with how he could use that over the course of the season.
Ultimately, Tim, does having a higher payroll, does it lend itself to more wins, or is it still a little bit of a roll of the dice? How good do you expect this Mets team to be this year?
Well, I think you'd rather be spending this amount of money than not, probably. If you look at it in a vacuum, you'd rather be here than running the Oakland A's payroll, for sure. It doesn't guarantee you anything, particularly, again, in this division. I don't know what the Vegas betting odds are, but it wouldn't surprise me if Atlanta is actually the favorite in the National League East, given the way that they've played over the last several years. And, they don't have to run as high a payroll because they've extended their players at younger points in their careers to long-term deals. So, I think certainly the expectations here are high. If the Mets flame out in the first week of October again this year, that will be another big disappointment in Queens. But I don't think they're planning the World Series parade down the Canyon of Heroes just yet in Manhattan.
And you think the 6-man rotation, a possible implementation of that, could maybe be an X factor heading into this year for them to keep everybody healthy and give them the strength that they need?
Yeah, I think having that starter depth that you can turn to during those longer stretches in May or in August, even late September, I think they've got a stretch of 17 games in a row that, if you're able to give guys the kind of rest you want, you don't want to give them too much rest. That happened a little bit to Max Scherzer a couple of years ago with LA. But if you're able to give them kind of the adequate rest they want, maybe you've got them kind of hitting their stride at the very end of the season rather than earlier.
Just last one for you, Tim. I remember opening day, was it the beginning of last season? Everybody was so behind Steve Cohen and excited to have ownership that would spend and spend and spend. And then, of course, they fell short of their ultimate goal last season. I mean, how do you sort of view the fan base and their relationship with team ownership? Will they continue to kind of support Steve Cohen if he does continue to spend, regardless of whether or not they win? Or do you really think that World Series drought needs to be broken in order to continue to have the support of Mets fans who are, can be challenging?
Well, right now he has total support of Mets fans. You go to spring training, there are people out waiting outside in shirts with Steve Cohen's face on them. So he is probably as popular an owner in baseball as anyone, maybe in professional sports as anyone at this specific moment. You never know how it can go over the next couple of years. If those big deals don't work out, if the Mets struggle, if they don't make the playoffs, if they don't win a World Series in that time frame that he initially laid out, which was 3 to 5 years of his ownership, that runs through 2025. If we're having this conversation in 2026, they haven't won anything, they haven't gotten deep into the postseason, maybe the fan base changes its tune a little bit. But I think he's bought himself plenty of time with the way that he's operated this franchise, especially when you juxtapose it against the way they were run for really the last 15 years with the Wilpon ownership.
Tim Britton of The Athletic, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate the insight.
Oh, thanks for having me on.